Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're going to cover all the new and returning spells that are in the Heroes of Faerun book that has just released recently. It's a player expansion, sort of additional, certainly optional rules for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. There's about 19 spells to cover. I thought I'd maybe just kind of change up the format a little bit from what I normally do. I have done tier lists before, but I just kind of want to do, shake things up just a little bit. So this is my tier list of all these spells based on pure 100% peer-reviewed vibes. I haven't really had time, of course, to test any of these spells or anything. I'm just kind of reading them, giving my opinions and thoughts on them, just kind of ranking them because kind of where I feel they kind of sit, but things may change in the future as we start playing with it and discovering maybe how broken or not some of these things actually are. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started with it, starting sort of in alphabetical order here. I think they're out of order in the bottom, but starting with Alestriel's Mooncloak. So we can see it's a 5th level spell available to Bard, Druid, Ranger, and Wizard. It's an action. It lasts for 1 minute with concentration. It gives you a 20-foot emanation around you with dim light. Gives you and your allies half cover within that emanation, and also resistance to cold, lightning, and radiant damage. And then you can choose to end it early by using one of the following options. Either when you fail a saving throw against being frightened, grappled, or restrained, you can choose to succeed instead, and again, ending the spell. Or you can use a magic action to give you or an ally hit points equal to 4d10 plus your spellcasting ability modifier. So half cover is actually pretty cool here. Half cover, if you're not familiar with it exactly, it gives you +2 to AC as well as +2 to your dexterity saving throws. So that is benefiting you and all of your allies who are within that emanation. We have that benefit, the +2 to AC, +2 to your dex saves, plus the resistance to cold, lightning, and radiant damage. For my opinion, certainly I'm really more focused on the passive effects of the spell. I don't really care about liberation or even respite that much. Certainly I would use them if the situation come up, but I'm really looking at this half cover and resistance. And while this is a 5th level spell slot, and certainly generally speaking, there are much better things I could be doing with my 5th level spells. Being able to give multiple members of your party, blanket AC boosts, something that's not really a very common effect. So in situations where I could not only benefit from the AC boost with my party, but as well as the cold, lightning, and or radiant damage resistance, I think I would actually be looking to take and or cast this spell. So if I'm in like a published adventure from Wizards of the Coast that I know these damage types are going to be very common, I would consider taking the spell on one of these casters if I was playing one of them. So for that reason, we're going to go ahead and put Alestriel's Mooncloak right here in B tier, B for begging for the right combat. It's not going to be good all the time, but when it is good, it's great. That's going to bring us to the next spell. This one is called Backlash. This is a 4th level abjuration available to Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. This one is a reaction, so a 4th level reaction. Reactions are pretty rare to begin with, but higher level ones even more so. It's a range of 60 feet. You can ward yourself against the triggering damage, reducing that damage by 4d6 plus your spellcasting ability modifier. And if that damage was from a creature within range, you can make them make a Constitution saving throw. Then they take force damage equal to 4d6 or half as much on a successful save. The damage reduction and the damage it deals both increase by 1d6 per spell level. So again, this is a 4th level reaction. It does, less damage than a Hellish Rebuke would at this level, which does the same sort of thing where it's dealing damage as a reaction. However, of course, this does have the benefit of reducing incoming damage. However, I really can't help but shake the feeling that I just probably have better ways to reduce damage using a 4th level or even lower spell slot than using just this one-off spell. And not even just reducing incoming damage to me specifically, but also just incoming damage to my party, just using spells that are better at doing that. This might be okay as a upgrade for Hellish Rebuke for Warlocks specifically, because they're going to be casting at the highest level spell slot anyway. And while, like I mentioned, it does do less damage than Hellish Rebuke, it does have that trade-off of absorbing damage, which gets more and more important as you get higher and higher in levels. But just generally for any other caster, I feel like I would be struggling to use this. So even though the numbers do seem decent on it, I just feel like it's competing with far too many better things. So this might seem actually a little harsh, but I'm actually going to throw this one down here at D tier for don't waste a spell slot on it. That's going to bring us to the next spell. This one is actually a returning spell. This one is Blade of Disaster. So this one was actually originally introduced in Icewind Dale Rime of the Frost Maiden, which I actually didn't know is specifically from that module. I've played through that one. I've run into these things. I've seen the damage that they can do. I just didn't realize that it's specifically from that module. So you can see the original version on top here. The new version from Heroes of Faerun is here on the bottom. It is available to the Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. Again, this is a 9th level conjuration spell. It's still a bonus action. There's only really a few changes. The original version dealt essentially triple damage on a crit as opposed to double damage, so it went from 4d12 to 12d12, whereas the new version just does 10d6 force damage on a hit. It still has an increased crit range, but now when that crits, it's going to do, of course, 20d6. And while that might seem like a really impressive, like a huge upgrade from 12d12, it's actually a slight downgrade on crit. 12d12 averages out to 78 damage, whereas 20d6 is 70 average damage. So it doesn't necessarily do quite as much damage on a crit. However, it now does more damage on average on every other hit that it does, increasing from 40, 12 to 10d6, which is 26 damage and 35 damage respectively on average. So not only has that changed, again, it's more average damage even if it's slightly less damage on a crit, but also the range that you can move it on subsequent turns has increased to 60 feet from 30 feet. So this is really just a sort of souped up spiritual weapon essentially. And while I think in comparison to other 9th level spells it maybe isn't quite as good, even as far as single target damage, I think a well used like Shape Change or True Polymorph could probably get you more mileage than this spell would for sure. But if you're just the kind of person who just wants to make a bunch of attacks, this is certainly the spell for you. So I'm actually just going to put this one in A tier. I think, you know, it's not a bad spell. There are certainly much better 9th level spells even trying to do just damage, but we're going to give it an A for just all of the attacks. That's going to bring us to the next new spell. This one is called Cacophonic Shield. So this is a 3rd level evocation available to bards, sorcerers, and wizards. Action to cast, concentration for 10 minutes. Thunderous reverberations fill a 10-foot emanation originating from you. Whenever that emanation moves into a creature space or a creature enters it for the first time, or they end their turn there, they have to make a Constitution saving throw or take 3d6 thunder damage and have the deafened condition. It is a save for half, and you can choose creatures who are unaffected by this spell. In addition to it, while this is ongoing, you have resistance to thunder damage, and ranged attacks against you have disadvantage. Additionally, you can also upcast it for an additional 1d6 damage. So if this sounds familiar, it certainly should. This is basically a different version of Spirit Guardians. Spirit Guardians basically for arcane casters, being your bard, sorcerer, and wizard, not available to the warlock, unfortunately. The damage maybe isn't quite as good as Spirit Guardians. Spirit Guardians is 3d8, right, if I recall correctly, or is it 2d8? I don't remember exactly, but somewhere in that range. Spirit Guardians does grant difficult terrain within the radius, whereas this one does the deafened condition and only 2 creatures who fail the saving throw. And the deafened condition in general, I think it's just a harder condition to really take advantage of. Like, I don't really know how you can capitalize on it really in a mechanically meaningful way. If you have any ideas about that I'm not aware of, please let me know in the comments. I'd definitely be interested to know. However, the resistance to thunder damage, when that comes up, is certainly good. Again, although again, it is that sort of situation where when you want to be resistant to thunder damage, you probably don't want to be dealing thunder damage. So maybe not quite so useful in that regard. However, range attack rolls being made against you at disadvantage is also very good. But it's really hard to figure out where I want to put this one. Again, I would say Spirit Guardians I would put up in S tier because it's just sort of a quintessential spell for the cleric specifically. And it's so good that other classes try to get it if they can, such as like the bard with magical secrets, if they want to do that sort of thing. But where the damage and the effect of the difficult terrain is just much more reliable for Spirit Guardians, whereas the deafened condition, resistance to thunder damage, and disadvantage on range attacks against you can be very situational. But I think I still maybe will put this up here at S tier just because it still does have all the same damage conditions of Spirit Guardians, where if you are building to cheese it by like having allies pull you in and out of an enemy's space so that it constantly triggers the damage over and over again, you know, you can still cheese it that way, the same way that you could with Spirit Guardians if you don't have someone in your party who has Spirit Guardians. If I was ranking within the S tier itself, I'd certainly place Spirit Guardians above Cacophonic Shield, but in general, I'd say they're similar enough that I feel comfortable putting them on the same tier. That then brings us to the next spell. This one is called Conjure Constructs, and I could have sworn that this was already a spell, but it's apparently not. Maybe I'm thinking of Summon Construct. Either way, 3rd level conjuration spell specifically only for wizards. Concentration up to 10 minutes, requires your action. You conjure a group of intangible spirits, medium size, modrons are the constructs, whatever. When you cast a spell and as a magic action on subsequent turns, you can command the spirits to target one creature or object within 5 feet of it and do one of the following actions. You can either make them make a dexterity saving throw, dealing some force damage or half as much on a successful save, or you can grant temporary hit points equal to 1d6 plus your spellcasting ability modifier. On subsequent turns, you can also move it 30 feet to another unoccupied space you can see. It also upcasts for additional damage and additional temporary hit points. And this should sound pretty familiar as well. This is basically a take on spiritual weapons. So in the same way that Cacophonic Shield was sort of a remix of Spirit Guardians, this is a remix of Spiritual Weapon. However, I think it's not as good as Spiritual Weapon in a lot of ways. Not only is it an action to cast, but it's also an action to continue using on each of your turns. Whereas the benefit of Spiritual Weapon is that it continues to use your bonus action, leaving your action to do better things. This does give you the ability to sort of play a support wizard, but even if that's the case, I just think there are better spells even as a wizard that I could be using to do that sort of thing. Even at 3rd level, I think a well-placed fly or haste in most situations will probably give you more value just as an overall party support. Like, you won't be doing the damage specifically, but you'll be enabling one of your party members to either get to a hard to reach target or giving them an extra attack with haste, which will likely do more damage than this thing is going to do. So again, again, maybe feeling a little harsh on Conjure Constructs here, but I'm going to place this one also here at D tier just because I don't see the appeal of taking this over other options. That then brings us to the next spell. This one is called Death Armor. This is a second level necromancy available to sorcerers and wizards. Action to cast it lasts for 1 hour without concentration. Notably, it does have a costly and consumed component, an onyx worth 50 gold pieces. Effectively, what this does is you place this buff on either yourself or an ally. They have advantage on death saving throws for the duration, and once per turn, whenever a creature within range hits them with a melee attack roll within 5 feet, that attacker will then take 2d4 necrotic damage. So I like that this doesn't require concentration. I do like that it's sort of enabling this sort of like Thorns sort of build, or what we might refer to as like retribution damage, like damage that is dealt back to an attacker. It is only once per turn, but I think it would be maybe too silly if it was more than once per turn, especially as creatures get more and more attacks, especially at these lower levels since this is only a second level spell. And while I don't think it's necessarily great on its own, if there were other features or like subclass features or anything along those lines that can sort of layer on top of this, like put this with an Armor of Agathis as well, and allow you to sort of create this character or place the spell on a character who's building like that to just further amplify that sort of Retribution Thorns type damage. So again, while I don't think that this is good on its own, I do think that it's good enough to be built around, so that's why I'm going to put it in B tier for build around me. So then moving on to the next spell, we have something called Darian's Helpful Homunculi. This is a second level conjuration available to clerics and wizards. It is an action or a ritual. It does require, again, a costly and consumed component, powdered gemstones worth 100 gold points, which it consumes, as well as one set of artisan's tools with which you have proficiency. The duration is 8 hours, no concentration. Effectively, what you're doing is just summoning a bunch of little constructs who have proficiency in the artisan's tools that you are using to cast this spell, as well as they specifically have proficiency in the Arcana skill as well. And generally, the purpose of this is to function as an assistant to you for when you're doing crafting. Because they have proficiency specifically in the Arcana skill, it seems like this is mostly intended to help clerics and wizards create spell scrolls during downtime. They can't work on spell scrolls themselves because they themselves don't have spells, but they can help you when you're crafting the spell scroll. So this is certainly not useless. It does require, again, a costly and consumed component, so there is certainly a tax here. You don't have to spend the spell slot since you can ritually cast it, and you are limited to that 8 hours, so if the spell scroll requires much longer amounts of time, then you might need to break this up on multiple days. You'll need to expend more gold to summon them to reduce that time total. So you have to figure out, is it worth it to spend this extra gold to do that? I don't think it's completely useless. It really depends if crafting is going to be good in your campaign, if you have the time and resources to do it. So for that reason, I will put it down here in C tier since it comes in clutch when crafting. Moving right on to our next spell, this one is called Dirge. This one immediately gave me, throwbacks to 3.5 where they had the Dirge Singer Bard, which was a subclass that I really liked a lot. Speaking of Bard, this is a 6th level enchantment spell available to bards as well as clerics. Casting time of an action lasts for 1 minute with concentration. It is a 60-foot emanation centered on yourself. Not only that, but you can designate creatures who are unaffected by it. Creatures in the area can't regain hit points while within the emanation. Then when the emanation enters a creature's space, or they enter it for the first time, or they start their turn there, they have to make a con save or take 3d10 necrotic damage and be knocked prone. They can only make the save once per turn, and of course it's a save for half. That on its own is already very good. Like, again, 60-foot emanation is going to cover or mostly cover most battle maps that I've usually seen. This is certainly a situation where even just the base casting of the spell is going to trap basically every enemy on the battlefield inside of it, and then you get to exclude all of your allies from it as well, so it is only affecting your enemies. However, if that wasn't good enough, you do have a special circle casting of the spell, and again, I covered circle casting in my previous video and sort of all the different things that you can do with that. This is a special option you can choose to do in lieu of any of the other normal options for circle casting. If you are going to circle cast the Dirge spell, it requires a minimum of 2 secondary casters, and if you cast it this way, the duration increases to 10 minutes with concentration, up from 1 minute. It is worth noting that each of the secondary casters must also expend a 4th level or higher spell slot, so you have to spend the 6th level spell, and the 2 secondary casters need to spend a 4th level spell as well. But when you do this, not only does the duration increase, but whenever a creature fails their saving throw against it, they also gain 1 exhaustion level. Not only that, but whenever a creature finishes a long rest, it does not reduce the exhaustion levels from this feature, nor do they regain the hit points that they would normally get from taking a long rest. This already feels very good, again, just as a base casting without circle casting the spell. Just the sheer size of it and the fact that you can exclude your allies and basically trap your enemies within this area to possibly be knocked prone every turn and not be able to regain hit points, that alone is very good. In situations where you're sort of able to also create this microwave, very similar to Sickening Radiance, and then constantly impose the exhaustion condition. Again, the exhaustion condition in 2024, the new rules, is a -2 per exhaustion level to all d20 tests, which which includes their saving throws. So this is very much a death spiral for affected creatures. So for that reason, I think this is very clearly going to be an S tier spell. We're going to put that as a high S tier. S for Sickening Radiance's long lost sibling. I think this is the kind of spell that's going to like motivate a lot of people to, certainly pick it up and cast it and try to find good ways to maybe use circle cast, if that's available from their DM, to really find situations to really kind of, change the texture of encounters. And of course, DMs then would also be able to use that against their players. I think that's just really going to create really threatening or interesting encounters overall. So that's then going to bring us to our next spell. This one is called Doomtide. This is a 4th level conjuration available to bards, clerics, and warlocks. It's an action to cast concentration for 1 minute. You create a 20-foot radius sphere of inky fog within range that creates magical darkness. That darkness can be spelled by a strong wind, such as one created by the Gust of Wind spell. However, each creature in the sphere, when it appears, makes a wisdom saving throw. On a failed save, they take psychic damage equal to 5d6, and then they subtract 1d6 from its saving throws until the end of its next turn. On a successful save, it's just a save for half, and a creature also makes a saving throw when it enters their space, when a creature enters the sphere, or when they end their turn there. It also says here that the sphere moves 10 feet away from you at the start of each of your turns. So again, just as a base casting of this spell, what you're basically looking at is a combination of Cloud Kill, in the sense that it's a cloud that kind of moves away from you on every turn, as well as Synaptic Static. And what you might notice when I'm saying both Cloud Kill and Synaptic Static is that those are both 5th level spells, whereas this is a 4th level spell. It has the potential to blind creatures who are in it with the magical darkness, but if that wasn't enough, it does have a special circle casting option. However, it is again worth noting that this one not only requires a minimum of 5 secondary casters, so it's very unlikely that maybe your party will have this available to them, but also requires additional spell components, which are 3 black pearls from Pandemonium, which is a specific plane within the world of D&D. And these components are consumed, so you can't, of course, replace them with a spell focus or a component pouch. So the circle casting of this spell feels very much something like the DM is supposed to use against their players. But when you circle cast it this way, the spell's range increases to 1 mile, and its duration changes to until dispelled and has no concentration. Each secondary caster must also expend a 3rd level or higher spell slot when they do the circle casting for this spell. So effectively, sort of a group of sort of evil casters can cast the spell from a mile away, sort of create this perpetual moving cloud of darkness that does a bunch of psychic damage, disrupts saving throws of creatures within it. Just sort of a very cinematic feel to this spell. But again, even the base casting of the spell is very, very good because you're getting the combination of 2 5th level spells within a 4th level spell. So for that reason, very similar to the Dirge spell, I think I would consider this one also an S tier spell. Would I consider this better or worse than Dirge? It's really hard to say. Maybe sort of on the same plane. S tier for somebody cooked here. Maybe it's a little too good, but I just like the cinematic feature of it with the circle casting as a DM from the DM perspective as well. Let's go ahead and move on to the next spell here. This one is Elminster's Effulgent Spheres, a 6th level evocation available to Druid, Sorcerer, and Wizard. Action to cast, lasts 1 hour, no concentration. 6 chromatic spheres orbit you for the duration. For the duration, you can do one of 2 things. When you take acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage, you can take a reaction to expend 1 sphere and give yourself resistance to the triggering damage until the start of your next turn. Or you can do an energy blast, use a bonus action to throw one of the spheres at a target within range, and they take 3d6 damage of a type of your choice. Spell ends early when you have no spheres remaining, and the number of spheres increases each time you upcast it. So for a 6th level spell slot, we're basically getting a combination of Mel's Minute Meteors, which I believe is a 3rd level spell, and then Absorb Elements, which of course is a 1st level spell. This doesn't require concentration, which is nice, but it does again end once we run out of spheres, and both of these options do consume the spheres. So in my opinion, this feels a little, especially coming down from Doomtide, which was a combination of 2 higher level spells. This one is a combination of 2 lower level spells and, very lower level spells like 3rd level and 1st level. And I really don't know if that juice is worth the squeeze. Maybe if the Absorb Energy didn't use spheres and you could sort of like sandbag the last sphere to maybe use that reaction as many times as possible for the duration, maybe that would be much better. But there are so many great 6th level spells that this one really just seems too pale in comparison. And by the time I have 6th level spells, my lower level spell slots are sort of just utility slots anyway. So I probably really don't feel that bad about using them for things like Absorb Elements. So this one, I'm not really enthused by it. Where is that one at? Effulgent Spheres. Again, I'm going to put this one down here in D tier, probably I would probably take it over Backlash. So I'm going to put this one in D tier because it doesn't live up to its spell level, in my opinion. That brings us to the next spell, which is also named after Elminster. This one is called Elminster's Illusion. That's illusion, like, you know, as in elusive, not illusion like the tricky spells. This is a second level abjuration available only to wizards. Casting time of a bonus action with a concentration of 10 minutes. It says an arcane ward protects you against magic for the duration. You have advantage on saving throws against spells and magical effects. Additionally, if you succeed on a saving throw against a spell or magical effect and would normally take half damage, you take no damage instead. So that is a very powerful effect. It is concentration, which is worth noting. It does last 10 minutes, which is a weird duration, but I do think it's worth noting that this is a very powerful effect. Again, being able to ignore damage when you succeed on a save and being able to succeed more often because you have advantage on those saves feels good. And of course, this is on a class that is, you know, historically very squishy. You know, it's not going to work against all saves. It does need to specifically be a spell or a magical effect. This is something that you can sort of keep prepared just to make sure that you have that trick in your pocket when it comes up. And I could just see this enabling sort of like a wizard tank sort of build, or being included in those sorts of builds for wizards. You know, it's not super common for wizards to act as a tank. We can certainly come up with options for that. And of course, if you are an abjure or a wizard, then this also feeds into your arcane ward. Just a lot of different things you can do. So I do think that this is a pretty good spell. I don't think it's great, but I do think it's pretty good, especially in the right situation. So for that reason, I'm going to put this here at B tier, probably right next here to Illustriel's Mooncloak. Probably consider those pretty similar, that they're both really good in the right situation. So definitely a solid B for boy, that wizard is hard to kill. That brings us to the next spell, which also has a namesake attached to it. This is the Holy Star of Mystra. Now we're looking at an 8th level spell, Evocation, available to clerics and wizards. A bonus action to cast, concentration of 1 minute. You create a glowing mote of energy that hovers above you for the duration, sheds bright light in a 5-foot radius and a dim light for an additional 5 feet, so a total 10 feet. When you cast a spell and as a bonus action on later turns, you can unleash a shining bolt, targeting one creature within 120 feet. Ranged spell attack, force or radiant damage on hit equal to 4d10 plus your spellcasting ability modifier. Pretty good. In addition, while the mote is present, you have 3/4 cover. And if you succeed on a saving throw against a spell of 7th level or lower that targeted only you and wasn't an area of effect, you can take a reaction to deflect that spell back at the spell's caster. And the spell's caster makes a saving throw against that spell using the caster's own spell save DC. So if their spell save DC is higher than yours, they have to make a save against themselves, essentially. So there's a lot going on here. And as far as 8th level spells go, there aren't really a lot of like point and shoot 8th level spells, you know, like damage based, target one target and deal damage to them 8th level. So that kind of variety is nice to see. The fact that it illuminates you is actually pretty good, and I think the reason that this is here is because many spells or spell-like effects that create darkness will say things like the darkness created by the spell can't be dispelled except by spells of such a level or higher. So because the spell not only has a spell attack associated with it, which would normally have disadvantage if you were stuck in darkness, but on top of that, the defensive benefits that come from having 3/4 covered would also be sort of counteracted if you were in darkness and were blinded and creatures had an advantage on attack rolls against you. So I think that this is creating light in order to dispel lower level magical darkness effects, at least within that radius around you, so that you don't have disadvantage on attack rolls, and attack rolls don't have advantage against you because of that darkness. The light is probably there for that reason. The sort of ranged spell attack here is very similar to the Crown of Stars, which is a 7th level spell. But I think one of the key things here is that 3/4 cover, because like I mentioned with Illustriel's Mooncloak, which grants half cover to you and your allies, which is +2 to your AC and dex saves, this one only affects you, but it's 3/4 cover, and 3/4 cover is a +5 to your AC and your dexterity saving throws. So not only is that just a generally good defensive boost, but again, remember that this spell is concentration, so that is also protecting your concentration from attacks made against you or against any dexterity saving throw based effect. And specifically for your dexterity saving throw, since you have that good boost, if a spell that targets only you requires a dexterity saving throw, you are much more likely to succeed on that spell, which means you're much more likely to be able to take that special reaction to throw that spell back at the attacker. So I do really like this spell a lot. I do think that the one thing that kind of keeps it sort of held back in my brain is that this is an 8th level spell, and by the time we get to like 7th, 8th, and 9th level spells, these are the levels where the spellcasters especially are starting to just get reality warping spells, and you know, dealing damage necessarily isn't the best thing a spell can be doing at this level. But for our blaster casters who want the defensive bonuses of it as well, I do think it is very good. So I do want to put this up here at A tier. I do think it is generally good. It doesn't necessarily need to be built around. You can just kind of cast it willy-nilly and it's still just going to do exactly what it does. And it's entirely possible also that we might see some new maximum AC records if you're focusing on a build that can just build as much armor class as possible, that is using the spell as well to maintain concentration and have that +5 to your AC, at least for that duration. So that was the Holy Star of Mistra. Let's go and move on to the next spell. This one is called Laeral's Silver Lance. This is a 3rd level evocation available to clerics, sorcerers, and wizards. It's an action to cast with an instantaneous duration, so it just happens. Silver energy bursts out from you in a 120-foot long, 5-foot wide line. Each creature of your choice within the line makes a strength saving throw. On a failed save, a creature takes 3d10 force damage and has the prone condition. On a successful save, they take half as much damage only. Damage increases by 1d10 for each time you upcast it. So this is very, very similar to Lightning Bolt. It is a slightly longer Lightning Bolt. However, it does half the damage, but you get to choose the creatures that are affected by it, and it can knock them prone. So that's very likely the reason that the damage is so much lower than a Lightning Bolt. And while I think this is fine. Again, this is a 3rd level spell. 3rd level is packed with all sorts of good spells, especially for the cleric, sorcerer, and the wizard. So many great options at this level, you know, and it's so much so that I just don't feel like an alternate Lightning Bolt is really the play. I think Lightning Bolt in general on its own is already something that maybe isn't picked up quite as often. There's like, why pick Lightning Bolt when a fireball will generally be able to catch more enemies in it anyway? But I just think it does such less damage that when I'm casting something like a Lightning Bolt or a fireball, I'm hoping to kill a bunch of little enemies in the area and not necessarily control them or knock them prone. This might be better if it was a different shape that covered a bigger area. If it was just like a sphere or even a cone, I think it would be pretty good. I just think lines by their nature are just a little bit harder to use. For that reason, again, I'm just kind of not really super excited about this one. So I'm again going to put this one down here at D tier. Would I consider this over Backlash? Would I take this before I would take a spell like Backlash? Backlash is a 4th level spell again. Again, I just didn't like the fact that it's 4th level. Again, there's so many better things to do at 4th level. I'm going to put this, down at D tier. You know, D4, don't know why I would take this spell. So moving on up the alphabet, we now have Symbol's Synostodwemer. I hope I said that right. This is a 7th level transmutation available to sorcerers and wizards. Action to cast lasts for 1 hour without concentration. You imbue one creature you touch with magical healing energy for the duration. So not necessarily yourself, but you can cast it on an ally if you want to. Whenever the target casts a spell using a spell slot, the target can immediately roll a number of unexpended hit point dice equal to the spell slot's level and regain hit points equal to the roll's total plus your spellcasting ability modifier. Those dice are then expended. So this is kind of similar to the Regenerate spell, which is also a 7th level spell. Although at the same time, those are two very different spells, because the Regenerate spell, of course, just regenerates 1 hit point at the start of each of that creature's turns. It does a bunch of initial healing, but just over the course of the duration of 1 hour, heals 1 hit point every 6 seconds, essentially. It also has the benefit of regrowing limbs as well, whereas this one is much more about burst healing, because you have to roll a number of unexpended hit point dice equal to the spell slot's level. If I'm under the effect of the spell and I cast a 6th level spell, if I choose to use this effect, I have to spend 6 unexpended hit point dice, and then I can regain that many hit points, plus my spellcasting ability modifier. It makes this much better than regeneration sort of in combat, at least. I guess this could be okay. But in terms of just the overall healing that you could get throughout the duration, this is much more limited since it is based on the finite resource that is your hit point dice. Whereas regenerate, again, is the basically, 1 hit point every 6 seconds for the hour, which is a minimum of 600 hit points plus the initial healing that it does. So for out of combat or between combat healing, certainly I think regenerate goes a lot farther. But within a specific combat where you're just like, man, I really need healing and no one else has got it, I think this could be useful. But again, similar to the Holy Star of Mistra, we're at the level of spells where, especially for your sorcerers and wizards, again, they're reshaping reality at this point. So just doing a bunch of healing maybe isn't always the best case, or maybe always the best strategy. While I don't necessarily hate this, I'm just gonna put this one down here at C tier for could have been better. Moving on to the next spell, we have Sungal's Elemental Suffusion. This is sort of a vertical one because there is an image next to it on D&D Beyond, but it's a 5th level transmutation available to Druid, Sorcerer, and Wizard. Action to cast, concentration up to 1 minute. And this gives us 3 different effects. One, when we cast the spell, we can choose to gain resistance to either acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage. We also gain a fly speed of 30 feet and can hover. And then we also gain an elemental pulse, where when we cast this spell and then at the start of each of our turns, we release a burst of energy in a 15-foot emanation. Each creature of our choice within that emanation makes a dex save or takes 2d6 damage of our choice of acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder. And and when they fail to save, they have the prone condition. On a successful save, they take half as much damage only. So just on the base casting of the spell, again, this is a 5th level spell. We're seeing sort of the combination of the fly spell, which is a 3rd level spell, protection from energy as well, which is another 3rd level spell, as well as having the sort of passive damaging aura that, you know, erupts at the start of each of our turns, as well as when we cast the spell. Not really a comparable spell that has that effect, but we're at least getting the benefit of 2 3rd level spells, which is pretty decent, and fly for sure is a great one to have in the right situation. This does kind of want you to be in melee range, so I don't know how useful that would be for, you know, like a sorcerer and a wizard. However, I could see this being very fun on like a moon druid build where you cast this as an action and then wild shape as a bonus action and fly around and try to knock a bunch of creatures prone, that sort of thing. And I will say I also really appreciate the fact that we get to choose which resistance we get and what kind of damage we deal separately. That is a very good thing. I like seeing that. I wish they would do that more often when these things come up on the same feature. However, again, that is just the base casting of the spell. If you cast this as a circle spell, it has a special circle casting function. Again, you use this function in lieu of any of the other functions that are available through circle casting that I covered in my previous video. If you cast this as a circle spell, you can have any number of secondary casters, you know, minimum of 1 or more. Each secondary caster must also expend a 2nd level spell slot or higher. When you do so, its duration increases to 10 minutes with concentration, up from 1 minute with concentration. Then for that duration, yourself and each secondary caster all benefit from the effects of this spell. So not only are you flying around with resistance to damage and sort of having this eruptive damaging aura around you, all of the participating secondary casters do that as well. So as a standalone 5th level spell, again, 5th level spell, there's a lot of good things going on at that level. I don't think if I were doing this only on me that I'd really be motivated to cast this spell just for me. However, in a caster heavy party, I could definitely see me taking the spell and kind of planning circle casting around that, because having one person with the effect, it's fine. The more casters in your party that you have using this effect, and by the time you have 5th level spells, even your half casters have access to 2nd level spell slots, so they can use this as well. And so you're basically giving your half casters the ability to gain the benefits of a 5th level spell at a much lower level. For that reason, I think this is very good specifically when you are circle casting the spell, and it gets even better for each secondary caster that you're putting this on. Since this is sort of a build around me sort of spell, I'm going to put this up here at B tier, sort of a very high B tier, probably even better than Illustrial's Mooncloak. You know, each secondary caster that gets it just makes it that much better. So we're almost done here. Let's move on to the next spell. We have Spellfire Flare. We have a 1st level spell. This is an evocation spell available to sorcerers and wizards. It's an action to cast, instantaneous duration. You unleash a blast of brilliant fire. We make a ranged spell attack against a target within range. The target gains no benefit from half or 3/4 cover for this attack roll, and on a hit, it deals 2d10 radiant damage. When we upcast the spell using a higher level spell slot, we create a separate beam that does the same damage, but it can attack either the same target or a separate target. So this is sort of comparable to Scorching Ray, which is a 2nd level spell, which has multiple beams as well. Each of those beams deals 2d6 damage, if I recall correctly, but you get 3 beams at 2nd level, whereas Spellfire Flare at 2nd level would only have 2 beams. However, the damage on this is actually pretty good. 2d10 is an average of what, 5.5 up to 11 for 2d10. So that would be what, 22 average damage for 2 beams at 2nd level, which is 1 point higher than the 3 2d6, which is an average of 7 times 3, which is 21. So like 1 point of more max damage at 2nd level compared to Scorching Ray cast at the same level, of course. However, again, Scorching Ray does have more beams. So when you take accuracy into account, if you have low accuracy, Scorching Ray is probably better because you're more likely to hit at least once. However, as accuracy approaches 100%, then Spellfire Flare will take over. So certainly a very good spell. I love these kind of ray-based attack rolls. It is nice to have sort of an alternate to Scorching Ray. Not only that, but it's available 1 level sooner. I don't think that I'd put this quite at S tier, but I'm going to put it at a pretty high A tier, and it's even at lower, like probably, yeah, high. I know Bladed Disaster and Holy Star Mister are 9th and 8th level spells respectively, but just for the fact that this is available so early and it's so good, and you know, it's arguably better than your 2nd level spell with Scorching Ray that it's comparable to, I would say that's a very high A tier spell. A for almost as good as Chromatic Orb. I think I would still take Chromatic Orb in pretty much every other situation just because just like the bouncing effect of it and the fact that it eventually becomes sort of deterministic once you upcast it to a certain point that it's guaranteed to bounce every time. But for its level, Spellfire Flare is definitely very good. So speaking of Spellfire, let's look at the next spell. This one is called Spellfire Storm. This is a 4th level evocation available to sorcerers and wizards. Action to cast, concentration for 1 minute. You conjure a pillar of Spellfire in a 20-foot radius, 20-foot high cylinder. Cylinder creates bright light. Each creature in it makes a con save or takes 4d10 radiant damage or half on a successful save. Creatures also make the save when they enter the spell for the first time on their turn or when they end their turn there, and they can only make the save once per turn. In addition, whenever a creature within the cylinder attempts to cast a spell, they have to make a Constitution saving throw, and if they fail, then the spell fails entirely and they lose the bonus action, action, or reaction that they were using to cast that spell. However, if they were using a spell slot, then that spell slot isn't expended, so this is very, very similar to just basically being counterspelled. And not only that, but it says when you cast this spell, you can designate creatures to be unaffected by it. So very similar to the Dirge spell that we saw before. You know, this is a pretty noticeable radius, about the size of a fireball, and you can choose allies to be unaffected by it so that your spellcasters can cast freely within it and not worry about taking damage, whereas enemy spellcasters do have to worry about taking damage as well as possibly having their spells countered every time they try to cast a spell. Unfortunately, you can't move this cylinder, so just sort of on its own, there's nothing really stopping enemy spellcasters from just walking out of the radius. So this does seem like a spell that really wants you to be working with your allies to sort of play monkey in the middle and sort of keep enemies within it so that they're always suppressed by the effect and your allies aren't affected by the spell at all. So with the right teamwork in the right situation, this could be a very good spell to use. In addition to the base casting of the spell, of course, it does have this alternate circle casting option as well. When you use this special circle casting option, you do need to provide an additional material component, a blue star sapphire worth 25,000 gold, which the spell consumes. When you do this, the spell's range increases to 1 mile and it no longer requires concentration, and each secondary caster must expend a spell slot of 3rd level or higher when they circle cast this spell. You can also see on the table below that for each secondary caster, when you cast the circle spell this way, also can increase the radius and height of the cylinder as well as the duration of the spells. It also says when you use a higher level spell slot that the damage increases, although it's unclear if that is only when you are circle casting the spell based on where it's positioned under the circle casting option, or if when you upcast it without circle casting it, if you get the increased damage as well. That's not super clear. I wish they had formatted this a little more clearly. So again, I don't think that this is a bad spell. It is, again, difficult to use just on your own if your party isn't sort of playing with you and isn't trying to keep enemies within the area of the cylinder. And again, it is most effective against spell casting enemies, which isn't going to come up all the time. So again, I'll put that down here in the B tier since it's sort of a build around me spell. Again, B for bully wizards with your friends. This is going to bring us to the penultimate spell here. So we have something called Siluna's Viper. This is a 3rd level conjuration for druids and wizards. It is a bonus action to cast with a duration of 1 hour. It says a shimmering spectral snake encircles your body for the duration. You gain 15 temporary hit points, and then the spell ends early if you have no temporary hit points left. While the spell is active, you gain the following benefits. First, you have climbing speed equal to your speed. Then it has an active feature that says as a magic action, you can make a ranged spell attack against a creature within 50 feet. Hit, the target takes 1d6 force damage and has the poison condition until the start of your next turn. While poisoned, the target has the incapacitated condition. And then you can upcast this as well for each spell slot above 3. The number of temporary hit points increases by 5, and the amount of damage of the venomous bite increases by 1d6. So the whole thing around the temporary hit points should sound pretty familiar. This is, you sort of consider this like an alternate Armor of Agathis, although where Armor of Agathis is a 1st level spell that can be upcast for 15 temporary hit points at a 3rd level spell. This one is just a 3rd level spell that gives you the 15 temporary hit points and then increases at the same rate that Armor of Agathis does. Again, the temporary hit points also work exactly the same as Armor of Agathis does, where you don't need to maintain the temporary hit points from this spell specifically to maintain the duration of it. So if you were to cast Siluna's Viper and then later cast Polymorph on yourself to give yourself, a bigger pool of temporary hit points, that refreshes your pool of temporary hit points. And the Venomous Bite is actually kind of nuts. It doesn't do a lot of damage, but the damage clearly is not the point of this. What you're trying to do is just poison the creature when you hit, and again, hits are much more reliable than saving throws most of the time. So as long as the creature you're attacking is able to be poisoned, you can basically just pick out a creature every turn and try to incapacitate them. They can still move when they're incapacitated, but they can't take any actions, bonus actions, or reactions. So if you're in a combat where you just kind of like maybe a few key enemies that are maybe pretty tough but are still susceptible to the poison condition, you can really just kind of point and try to take one of them out of the round each time you take your turn. That is a really powerful effect. I know I harp on the poison condition a lot because it is the condition that has the most immunities to it, but that doesn't mean that situations won't come up where this will completely just, trivialize encounters essentially. It's not going to incapacitate like a horde of enemies like a Hypnotic Pattern would. Then I think a spell like this can go a long way, and again, you could extend that use of it over a longer duration since it lasts 1 hour, whereas Hypnotic Pattern is a one and done. So if it's like a longer dungeon crawl and you just want to have this running the whole time, you can certainly get a lot more use out of this than you could with something like Hypnotic Pattern. So again, certainly not good all of the time. If creatures have defenses against poison, they're usually just immune to it, but if they're not immune to it, then they're going to get just trounced by this spell. So I'm going to put this up here at B tier, probably a very high B tier for, boy, when it's good, it's certainly great. And so that's going to bring us to the final spell of this video. This is the spell called Ward Away. This is a first level abjuration spell available to bards, clerics, paladins, and wizards. It's an action to cast, just instantaneous duration. Roll a disorienting magical force toward a creature within range. The target must make a Constitution saving throw. Constructs and undead automatically succeed on the save. On a failed save, they take 2d4 force damage. Their speed is halved until the start of your next turn, and on their next turn, they must take an action or bonus action, but not both. On a successful save, they only take half as much damage. Upcast for 2d4 additional damage for each spell slot above the first. And I really wish that we could have ended this video on a high note. I just think that for a whole action, doing 2d4 damage is really not great. And I think what is bothering me about this spell is that it's trying to do so many things. It's doing damage, it's reducing speed, and it's trying to remove an action from a creature as well. And because it's trying to do so much, it's not doing enough. If I want to do damage with a first level spell, I have better options. If I'm trying to control creatures with a first level spell, I have better options. The choice between an action or a bonus action really isn't a choice. I think most of the time they're just going to take their action because that's the most impactful choice that they can make. I think the choice between action or movement would be much more impactful. There are many more bonus actions in the monster manual, even at these lower levels. So, I mean, you are going to get some mileage out of it, probably most of the time when you cast this, if they fail to save. But again, if I'm trying to control an enemy, I would rather just use something like Tasha's Hideous Laughter. If I want to deal damage, I could, I have Spellfire Flare, or just literally any other first level spell that does damage is probably going to be better than this. Even just a Magic Missile is going to be better than this. So for that reason, again, I'm not really just a big fan of this one. I'm going to put down here at D tier. Maybe I would take it over Backlash, but again, D tier is here for, don't think I'd ever use it. Most of these spells, I don't think I'd ever really consider using most of the time. Maybe I'm missing something with one of these spells. You can certainly let me know down in the comments. What are your all first impressions of these spells? Where would you kind of place things? Where do you think I maybe overestimated certain spells or underestimated others? Maybe we'll come back to this in the future if any of these spells sort of really take off to really shake up the rankings here. But again, mostly this was really just a for fun video. Definitely interested to know what your guys' thoughts are down in the comments below. How do you feel about some of these spells? Do you feel that maybe that some of them are maybe like too much power creep? Do you think in general, regarding the Heroes of Faerun book, are you going to be implementing a lot of the things like circle casting and some of these spells that are available as well? I'd be interested to know all that and more down in the comments below. So again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.